Good afternoon. Welcome to the Korea Society, to the Samsung Center, and to this special part of our series on legacies in Korea-U.S. relations. We're absolutely delighted to welcome you, our studio audience, to those of you viewing online or listening, and really to our very special guest today, Ambassador Stephen Bosworth, who is a distinguished public servant, a friend I can see to many here in our studio audience, and really one of the leading thought leaders on Korea. The series on legacies in Korea-U.S. relations dates back about 2 years, and we have invited a number of distinguished individuals in over time. To date, most of those have been from the humanitarian affairs or the corporate sector, and Ambassador Bosworth is our first from the area of public service, and his contribution and leadership in public service and in academe is really quite remarkable. Ambassador Bosworth currently serves as a senior fellow with the Belfer Center at Harvard University's Kennedy School. He is also the chairman of the U.S. Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins SAIS. His career, as many of you know, is really one amazingly distinguished. Three-time ambassador, including ambassador to Seoul. His leadership of Aikido, the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization. His deanship at the illustrious Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, founded in 1933 by Harvard and Tufts University, and really his ability as a special representative for the administration on North Korea policy to negotiate with the North Koreans in the first term of the Obama administration. And so we're absolutely delighted to have you here, Ambassador Bosworth. We thank you for flying in from Boston. And we're delighted to have you wrap up our policy season here at the Korea Society. Many of your admirers and colleagues like John Park and Sung Yoon Lee have been with us in recent weeks, and it's just a thrill to have you here.
Thank you.
It is, with these legacy series, such an amazing opportunity for us here at the Korea Society to both salute and to ask for your reflections on the Korean Peninsula and how you've seen it. I thought I'd begin by asking you a very general question about where you see Korea, its place, its growth, and opportunities and challenges. And then I'd like to move into a discussion of your career, and I'll probably first ask you about the Aikido period.
Mm-hmm.
But
Sure. Well, in looking at the present state and future of the Korean Peninsula, of course, it's essential to start by deciding which Korea you're going to talk about, because the contrast is striking. I first went to South Korea in the late 1980s, and it was impressive because of the activity and the sort of underlying energy of the place. But when I went back during my time as the executive director of Aikido, it was clear that Korea was entering into a new stage of modernization, if you will, and that Korea would be one of the real leaders of Asia. And I think that has come about. And I think it's due largely to the dynamism of the Korean people, their willingness to defer instant gratification and invest in their future rather than immediately consume all that they were enjoying as income back in the 70s and 80s. So it's a kind of classic success story. North Korea is a very different proposition, very sad, even tragic, because the two people are not that different, despite the separation of 60 years. But North Korea's prospects look very bleak indeed. The one thing I've come away from over the last several years, having dealt with both North and South Korea, is an understanding that they are the same people. And if there could be some sort of arrangement politically that would allow the North Koreans to sort of be unleashed and give them the opportunities to take advantage of their inherent dynamism and entrepreneurship, I think that while they have a long way to go, I think the gap could be closed and relatively quickly. But I would emphasize I don't see that happening at any time in the near future.
Interesting, and we appreciate that, and really essentially important message. We've done a lot here this fall on unification. We've just had a representation in from the new Presidential Committee on Unification Preparation, and the Unification Minister himself will be here on Monday. And that essential message about the commonality is one we tried to underscore to American audiences as part of our 60-year mission to educate on Korea. You have been able to really serve the United States, and I think by extension serve the people of the entire Korean Peninsula through an array of very distinguished positions. I guess though you had the ambassadorship in the Philippines, in Tunisia prior, I would probably begin asking you, for the sake of time today, about your experience with Aikido.
Mm-hmm.
And Aikido still stands, at least in my mind and those of some of my peers, is really an interesting type of post-Cold War organization. Frankly, I think some of the critics were very quick to close the door on what many of us think could well reemerge as the type of organization that serves things like energy needs or agricultural needs, et cetera, on the Korean Peninsula. And I wanted to reach back to an excellent text edited by Kyung-Hae Park and Kim Dal-chung called Korean Security Dynamics and Transition. And in the chapter on multilateralism that I'd written, there is a section that has a summary of something you said at the time. Former Aikido Executive Director and U.S. Ambassador to South Korea and Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Stephen Bosworth, suggested in an early annual report that, quote, Aikido has become an important figure on the political landscape in Northeast Asia. And went on to say Aikido might well typify the sort of multilateral cooperation effort we're likely to see in the post-Cold War era, ad hoc, mission-oriented, temporary, and therefore cost-effective. Mm-hmm. How do you look back at your time and that as sort of an institution?
Well, my time at Aikido was one of the high points of my professional career. I really enjoyed it. It was the first time that I worked directly with South Koreans. I had had a lot of exposure to Japan over the years, but not much to South Korea. And of course, I had had no exposure to speak of to North Korea. And there were many occasions when, as the executive director of Aikido, I found myself, as I would say at the time, the meat in a Korean sandwich, because North and South Korea were both coming at me for something. I was blessed in those years by having two deputies who were one Japanese and one South Korean, who were absolutely outstanding. One of whom, the South Korean, Che Young-jin, has gone on to have a very illustrious career, both in the Korean Foreign Service and, of course, at the UN. So he became not only a valued associate, but a very close friend, as did Umezu Itaro, his Japanese counterpart. But we were making it up as we went along, which was the kind of fascinating thing about this. I was recruited to do this by Bob Gallucci, who had negotiated the agreed framework and then couldn't wait to get out of this. He had other plans for the rest of his career. So he and Tom Hubbard sort of leaned on me hard to leave what was a very comfortable position at the U.S.-Japan Foundation and take on this unknown animal. We didn't have any employees. We had no office space. We had no administrative regulations, nothing. So we rented some temporary office space here in Manhattan and started going. And almost immediately we found ourselves in a very difficult negotiation with the North Koreans, trying to agree with them what it was we were going to do. I mean, in the agreed framework, the U.S. had committed on behalf of South Korea and Japan to provide 2,000 megawatt light water reactors. But there was no stipulation as to how that was going to be done, what they would look like, where they were going to be provided from, anything. So that negotiation was probably the most um, detailed and in some ways arduous negotiation of my career. And as you can imagine, dealing with those three countries, South Korea, North Korea, and Japan, stirred up animosities of history and a tendency to look back rather than forward, which were really remarkable.
Mm.
And it was, to me, remarkable that we actually did negotiate the so-called supply agreement. So that was a time that I really enjoyed, and I learned a lot, courtesy in many cases of my two deputies who were great instructors. And I learned a lot about dealing with North Korea. Not that I found any secret code to dealing with North Korea, but I came away from that 2.5 years with a conviction that at least at that time, it was worthwhile negotiating with the North Koreans. First, they're not crazy. That's a myth that has been perpetuated by people in this country and elsewhere. They're not crazy, and it's worthwhile to negotiate agreements with them if you can. Secondly, with regard to Cato, they kept every one of the agreements that we negotiated with them. And I don't want to get in here to a discussion of why the agreed framework eventually flew apart. I could argue that either way, but simply to say that the U.S. is not without some degree of responsibility for that. But in any event, those two lessons, that they're not crazy, you can negotiate with them. They are the same people in many respects as the South Koreans, despite a very different political environment that they've grown up in. And they will keep agreements if you can actually nail it down. I mean, you've got to be very, very meticulous in negotiating with them. Because if there's left any wiggle room at all, they will slip through it.
And perhaps when we discuss here in a second your time as a special representative, we can get back to some of this issue of negotiating with the North Koreans. At the conclusion of your tenure with Aikido, you then moved to Seoul as the U.S. ambassador during what many people who study modern diplomatic history in Korea think was perhaps the most exciting in terms of at least an initiative to engage that looked like it was moving to a potential visit by President Clinton, and it was just a time of a great circulation of ideas and a push forward. How do you reflect on that time?
Well, at the time, when I arrived in November of 1997, the relationship with North Korea was very much in the background for all of South Korea because their economy was falling apart. This was a very severe financial crisis. And everything that South Korea had worked for in the preceding 30 years was very much at risk. And we, the U.S., had to make some very fundamental decisions as to what we were going to do, how we were going to do it, to what extent would we find ourselves involved in the solution. And that, in some ways, was the part of my experience in Korea that really was the most riveting. Now, when Kim Dae-jung was elected, just 30 days after Chris and I had arrived there, it became clear that he had some ideas about what he wanted to do with regard to the North, and he was determined to implement those. And we, in the U.S. side, concluded that those ideas made some sense as long as they could be adopted without taking too much risk. And that's what we did. We supported Kim Dae-jung, but stressed always our role was to be there as a deterrent to any effort by the North to take advantage. And that's when the Perry process began. Cato was still in existence, and the agreed framework was still in existence, but by that time it had become somewhat questionable as to where Cato was going. But that was a time in which, culminating in the visit there of DJ to Pyongyang and then Madeleine Albright's trip, it was, I think everyone felt a sense of some hope that maybe there was going to be somewhat of a breakthrough. And we can talk about why that didn't happen. But it was a time of optimism.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that didn't happen in the end?
Well, first of all, I think that the basic problem, in my view, was that there was not then and is still not now, and I don't mean to be critical, there was no real consensus in South Korea as to how to deal with the North. And this is a difference of view within the South that has prevailed since the Korean War, since before the Korean War. And we refer to it as the conservative-progressive split. But in the end, I think it didn't happen for two reasons. One, there was a change of administration in the U.S., and when the Bush administration came in, there were people in that administration who had been dedicated to the proposition that the agreed framework was a massive strategic error for the United States, and were determined to get us out of that. It was also very much the fault of the North Koreans, because they didn't give DJ what he would have needed to sustain his policy for an extended period of time. In other words, there was not much reciprocity. There were those in South Korea who believed that it was fine to give the North money. And somebody once told me, well, we're exporting dollars and money in return for peace. And that's, from South Korea's point of view, not a bad deal. The problem was there was no indication of permanent, durable change coming. And I think in retrospect, that was due as much as anything else to the inherent weakness and fecklessness of the North Korean regime.
At the conclusion of your ambassadorship, you then jumped into the academic world as dean of the Fletcher School for a very long period, from 2001 to 2013.
Right, 12 years.
Yeah. And 11 or 13, did I get that right?
2013.
Yeah, so a very long period. How did you feel? How different was that? How were you able to take your principles and priorities and put those in an educational setting?
Well, I had the advantage of having some exposure to higher education in the U.S. through my service on the Board of Trustees at Dartmouth College, where I graduated, and I was eventually chair of the board. So I wasn't totally unfamiliar with the pressures of higher education. I will confess that I never would have forecast that I would find myself as an academic administrator. And I didn't set out to get that job. I was recruited by the Fletcher School and ended up deciding that this was a very attractive thing to do. And I enjoyed it enormously. Witness the fact I stayed 12 years. It wasn't just inertia that caused me to be there. I had a feeling of actually accomplishing some things. And I think that the Fletcher School was a very strong institution long before I arrived, but hopefully I left it a little stronger than it was when I came. And I think in many things, that's about all you can really ask. And I was pleased to see that when I left, there was a lot of competition for the job. A lot of people wanted it, and they were able to recruit Jim Stavridis, the former NATO commander, as my successor. So he followed me. I had followed Jack Galvin, another former NATO commander. So again, I was the meat in the sandwich in this case.
That's great. And you certainly took a very strong interest, I think, in raising Asia and its profile there. It already had a very strong North Pacific program, and through your efforts, now has a Korea Foundation, Kim Koo Foundation professor teaching on Korea and real constituency for Korean issues.
Well, yes, and I think that that's one of the things that I'm most pleased about in terms of what I was able to do there with a lot of support from the faculty. But we also, we put into place a program and a curriculum in international business, a Master of International Business, which we thought responded to a shifting set of demands in the private sector, trying to ensure that our graduates would be well prepared to be hired and then to succeed. It's still a school that is heavily devoted to public service, and I'm not curious, but I'm interested now that I'm over at the arch enemy at the Kennedy School, that in fact you could take the Kennedy School students, and I just taught this past semester a course with John Park. And you could take the young people in that course and put them at the Fletcher School and the other way around, and you really wouldn't notice any difference. Now, that's not to say there's not a difference between Harvard and Tufts, but there's no real difference between the students that go there. In fact, the Kennedy School, I think, probably has even somewhat greater an emphasis on public service. So I've been pleased to see that.
Yeah, and you've also offered some very positive reinforcement to Johns Hopkins SAIS through the wonderful U.S.-Korea Institute. You've also lectured recently at Stanford University.
Yes.
So your contribution and leadership in academic circles is very notable.
Well, you're kind. I never would have predicted, as I said, that I would end up spending 12 years and more now in higher education, in academia. That was not where I started. Obviously, I joined the Foreign Service right out of undergraduate school, and left after the Philippines. And thought I would probably never come back, and then I keep coming back. No more. I mean, I've been done with it.
And then in the midst of all this, government service also claimed you again through your role as a special representative. So the Obama administration calls and offers you this role. And how did you see that, and how did you see your tenure there?
Yeah, I'm still trying to sort that out to some extent, because I insisted that I was not willing to leave Fletcher entirely to go to work in this administration. I had done that a couple of times, and it's arduous, and it's disruptive of family life and personal life. But Secretary Clinton, I think being aware of that, asked me if I would come in on a part-time basis as a special representative, which I was, in the end, with a lot of support from the then president of Tufts, Larry Bacow, I was pleased to do. And when I asked Larry what the university's view of this would be, he said, remember this forever, he said, well, we say that public service is part of our mission. How could I tell you you can't do this? So I did it. I thought I would do it maybe for 6 months or 12 months. I ended up doing it for 2.5 years. And it was not, in terms of accomplishment, by any means the most satisfying part of my career. By this time, the history with North Korea was even more difficult than it had been when I came to Cato. But I'm glad I did it, and it's sort of like the fire bell ringing for the war horses. When the Secretary of State asks you to do something, you don't just say, "Well, I'd prefer not to."
Sure. And when you're negotiating with the North Koreans, by this point, more than a decade on from Keto and a decade on from your time as ambassador in Seoul, did you feel that the North Koreans were different? Had there been change? Was there stasis? Were they just completely frustrated with the prior 8 years that they were in an intransigent state, or did you see windows of opportunity? I guess in some, where does your negotiating experience earlier lead in terms of your abilities? And
well, the problems have become more complicated because the North Koreans were further along in their nuclear weapons program. The process had become multilateralized in a way that it had not during the Cato years. And the big change, of course, was China's leadership role. When I was doing Cato, I would go to Beijing from time to time, and it was hard for me to find people who really were willing to talk to me about Cato. We were eager to have China join, but China was not ready to get into that. Now, of course, China sees its position as one of leadership, and I think that will continue. They're not willing to do some of the things that some in the United States believe that they should do, but I understand the Chinese view on that. But it was more difficult. The North Koreans were even more suspicious than they had been. The U.S. was even more suspicious than it had been. There was very little common ground. Now, after I left that special representative job, I have a couple of times met informally and not officially with North Koreans in so-called Track 1.5 exercises. And as I found in Aikido, they're very pleasant people in many respects. Mm. Just that they work for a vile regime. And I have great sympathy for these officials, most of them from the foreign ministry, because, as I say, they're not a different species from South Koreans or from us, for that matter. But they're locked into this terrible, terrible regime that they're working for, mm-hmm. with, I think, very little room for maneuver.
John Park referred to you as a great myth buster. and when you are talking to audiences or to your graduates at places like Stanford or the Kennedy School or Fletcher or SAIS, what do you think is the biggest myth that Americans still cling to, or what is the obstacle, do you think, that we in the American mindset maybe most have toward the Korean Peninsula?
I think two things I referred to a bit earlier, that by definition North Koreans are crazy, and we feed this. We have movies being made, and they do things that from our perspective look to be irrational. Very few of those, I find, are truly irrational. If you look at the world through their optic, much of what they do makes some sense. If your only goal in life is the perpetuation of the regime, then that's what they think they have to do. But that's, I think, the biggest myth. The other myth is that somehow something else is going to solve this problem. Mm-hmm. I mean, for 25 years, we've been waiting for North Korea to collapse. And frankly, the fact that we believe that North Korea will collapse inhibits us from taking them seriously and from trying to deal with them in a serious fashion. Why should we make any concessions to them or try to construct a solution if we believe that soon there won't be any North Korea? Well, 25 years ago, we started that proposition. In fact, it was one of the underlying assumptions, quite frankly, of the agreed framework. But last time I checked, North Korea is still up there. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the big myth. The other myth is that somehow, because China doesn't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons, China can solve this problem if they can just be persuaded by us that it's in their interest to do so. Well, I've spent many late nights talking to my Chinese counterparts when I was doing the special representative job. And I'm not terribly optimistic that we're going to be able to persuade China that it's in their interest to squeeze North Korea hard enough to cause them to give up their nuclear weapons program and risk consequences that I think China views in the same light as a nuclear weapon state, North Korea. China does not see its interest as we tend to see China's interest. That's kind of an underlying problem of U.S. foreign policy, that we enjoy telling other people what their national interests are and think that we probably understand that better than they do. My friends in South Korea have had ample experience with that, as have my friends elsewhere around the world. And we do it now with China. China doesn't like that very much. And in any case, as I tell people, the North Koreans and South Koreans have had a couple of thousand years of experience in resisting Chinese pressure. So the notion that we're going to be able to persuade China to do things that will cause North Korea to change its fundamental view of the world, and we won't have to do anything, I think is probably not well founded.
Mm. If I can ask you one last question before
Sure.
turning to our audience, and that is looking at the expanse of your career, you've been in interesting places at very interesting times. We discussed before stepping up on stage that you'd been in Spain at the end of the Franco era. You were ambassador to the Philippines during the overthrow of Marcos and his departure. And during that same period, of course, just a bit after, we saw the changes in South Korea as it left behind its authoritarian legacy. And you've dealt with a great deal of that type of intransigence, I'm sure, with the North Koreans. I guess by way of general reflection, how do you look at the sort of the pacing of time and the changes that we have? And I think at essence, you are very much an optimist at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, I'm an optimist in several ways. I think that diplomacy matters. I think that we can find areas of common interest with many other countries, that we have to keep talking. I'm very wary of policies which seem to reward or to be founded on the assumption that it will be a major reward for other countries if we talk to them, and that in itself should be sufficient to cause them to have a different view of their own policies. I don't find that's very productive. But I don't believe in the end in the perfectibility of mankind, but I think we can do better than we're doing now, and we're doing better now than we've done at various times in the future. And if you look at a country like South Korea, you conclude that, given the right mix of policies and culture and all the things that we talk about with regard to South Korea, remarkable things can happen. I continue to think to myself that early in my career, the per capita income in South Korea was less than $100 a year. And here we are. They are a modern, industrialized, even post-industrial state with a robust economy and a thriving and fractious democracy, which is the way democracy in the end has to function. So yes, I'm an optimist. I think that in the last several years, the U.S. has become a little too inclined to use the hammer of our military supremacy, and I don't think that necessarily leads to good outcomes. And I hope that as we go forward over the next decade and beyond, we can rediscover the virtues of engagement in politics and diplomacy.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Ambassador Stephen Bosworth. No, thank you for that, and we appreciate that call to action, and we will continue to try to do good work like this here at the Society in the vein of what you're suggesting, and we resume here on January 30th with a discussion of the Hill, the new Congress and Korea policy. Ambassador Bosworth, thank you for taking the time to come in from Boston.
Thank you, Steve. I really have appreciated this, and I love the format. It's great.
Well, thank you. And for you and your wonderful wife, we have two lovely art books. We are about culture and policies. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we look forward to having you back soon
I would
and
love to
often.
do it.
Thank you all for joining us, and membership and other materials are available at the door and online. Have a wonderful Christmas and Hanukkah.